Wine Stories, a podcast to discover the world of wine by Etienne Pommier.
If you are fond of old vintages, or if you have inherited of the family's collection, you may have already come across antique bottles with a label or a stamp from Établissement Nicolas. For nearly 50 years, the French wine merchant, established in the early 19th century, has published a year-end catalogue for the festive season featuring a selection of fine and rare vintages from its library. But this was not a sales catalogue like any other, and each edition of Nicolas' fine wine list was highly expected by clients every year. Nowadays, the complete collection of these lists has become quite rare, and some catalogues are sought after like collectibles by connoisseurs. The design of these lists, the selection of vintages, and the way fine wines were proposed has a lot to tell us about the evolution of the fine wine market in France from the early 20th century to the 1970s. And that is why I have chosen today to tell you the story of Nicolas' fine wine list. Paris, 1822. Napoleon died in Sainte-Hélène only last year. We are in the heart of the French capital, Rue Sainte-Anne, number 53. This is where Louis Nicolas has recently opened his wine shop with a revolutionary idea: selling wine in bottles. At that time, people still buy wine by the barrel or consume it in the taverns, but sales in bottles are still rare. Bottling is done only for high-end wines at the client's request and typically performed by the negociants who buy directly from the domain or the chateau. Only a handful of wine collectors have already realized that chateau bottling is the best guarantee of quality, and Thomas Jefferson, ambassador of the newly independent United States of America in France during the French Revolution, is one of them. I've already told you the story of the Jefferson bottles in a previous podcast, and if you haven't listened to it yet, I invite you to look for the 11th episode of the first season titled Billionaire's Vinegar. For Nicolas, selling only in bottles quickly proves to be a successful move, and in 1840, the merchant innovates again with another revolutionary idea at the time: home delivery. Thanks to a network of warehouses across the greater Paris area, he proposes clients a home delivery service that contributes to the company's success and sets Nicolas apart from other merchants. In 1898, when he decides to step down and entrust the company to his son Etienne, Nicolas has already 42 stores in the French capital and its suburbs. 20 years later, there will be 130 of them. Etienne Nicolas isn't just a wise businessman, but he's also a man of his time, open to the artistic turmoil going on in Paris at the time, who promptly understands the upsides of collaborating with artists in order to develop his brand awareness. In 1922, he calls upon painter Drancy, who creates for him Nectar, a character inspired by one of the firm's delivery men that will personify the brand for years to come. In 1926, impressed by what he saw during the exhibition of decorative arts the year before, he asks architect Pierre Patou to imagine his new flagship store in authentic Art Deco style. Patou will eventually become one of the most famous architects of his era, designing the Galerie Lafayette in 1932, the interior decoration of the mythical cruise ship Normandy in 1935, and he will be hired in 1946 to rebuild the city of Tours destroyed by the World War II bombings. But what will greatly contribute to set Nicolas apart from the competition for years will be the publication from 1928 onwards of a year-end catalogue offering clients the finest vintages from its wine library. In 1924, Philippe de Rothschild, who has taken over the management of Chateau Mouton Rothschild 2 years ago, decides to start bottling his entire production at the chateau in a stand against the Bordeaux negotiations. And to make that first chateau bottled vintage even more special, he asks artist Jean Carlu to design for Mouton 1924 a label that would become historical. Maybe it is inspired by Baron Philippe's groundbreaking idea that Etienne Nicolas decides to call upon an artist to design his fine wine list every year, making it a one-of-a-kind catalogue that quickly becomes emblematic of Établissement Nicolas. For nearly 50 years, Nicolas works with prominent artists such as Kees van Dongen, Harad Ariyaku, Konstantin Tereshkovich, or André Dorin. For each edition, the artist creates the cover and illustrates the catalogue on a specific theme. The most famous example is the 1963 fine wine list featuring watercolors by famous expressionist Bernard Buffet that has now become a collectible. Some years are missing, such as 1937, 1952, or 1968, and the list hasn't been published either during World War II, only resuming in 1949. But apart from these exceptions, the fine wine list will be mailed to Nicolas' clients every year until 1973. Beyond the aesthetic quality of its design, the list's most important feature is to present each year a top-notch selection of France's finest wines coming from Bordeaux or Burgundy, but also Alsace, Anjou, or Jura. It proposes wines without mention of their producers, such as this 1924 Châteauneuf-du-Pape for 15 francs per bottle in the 1933 list, but also specific domains like the Château des Pirets in Savenière or Château Sudureau in Sauternes. Bordeaux Reds represent the majority of the catalogue in the 1930s, with nearly two-thirds of the list, and even though that ratio decreases over time, nearly half of the bottles featured in the 1973 edition come from Bordeaux. Each year, Burgundy reds and whites are largely represented, and the first list also includes a selection of premium champagne from prestigious houses such as Krug, Pommery, Roederer, or Bollinger. Curiously, champagne disappeared from the list after World War II, and I couldn't find the reason behind this change. Maybe they were simply featured in a different leaflet. However, the evolution of the list over time does illustrate certain trends that may be surprising to us considering today's wine market. And these changes reflect the changes in tastes and preferences amongst French wine lovers throughout the 20th century. The white Bordeaux category is the perfect example of this. In each catalogue, there is a white Bordeaux selection that features between 20 and 50 different chateaux and vintages, but almost exclusively sweet wines. Château Climens, Guiraud, Sudureau, La Tour Blanche, and of course Château d'Yquem. Till the late 1960s, only sweet Bordeaux whites are represented, and it's only in 1966 that a new Bordeaux dry white wines category emerges featuring labels such as Château Carbonieux, La Ville-Aubryon, or Haut-Brion Blanc. While this would be an anomaly today, it wasn't really back then, when the truly famous white wines from Bordeaux were only the ones from Sauternes and Barsac. In the 1958 list, Château Climens 1929 is featured at 1,000 francs, which is the same price as the 1929 Montrachet or Pichon Lalande 1928. Another element that shows the prominent place of premium sweet wines in the market back then is the presence in the 1960s and 70s of many premium German Rieslings, among the most prestigious and expensive bottles. For example, this Brandenberger Jungfer Auslese 1959 from the Mosel offered at 50 francs, the same price as Yquem 49 or Cheval Blanc 1947 in the 1969 list. Along the same lines, I could talk about the Château Chalon from the Jura being more expensive than the Corton Charlemagne. These examples show the evolution of our taste compared to our parents and our grandparents, but they also reveal the changes in the market compared to an era when people used to drink typically older wines than we do today. For the heart of the Nicolas list are the old vintages. When the first lists came out in the late 1920s, Nicolas had already been buying fine wines for over a century, and the company owns an exceptional collection. Back then, a wine merchant is expected to keep and store the best vintages until they are ready to be drunk. This is also because, since viticultural and winemaking techniques were more rudimentary back then than they are today, wines would typically require a longer time in the bottle to find their balance, especially in terms of tannin integration. In order to give you an idea of the way fine wine merchants were working back then, here are a few examples from the 1969 fine wine list I have in front of me as I'm talking to you. Chablis-les-Vaillons 1959, 10 francs. Meursault-Perrières 1952, 18 francs. Mazy-Chambertin 1961, 20 francs. Grands-et-Chezaux 23, 26 francs. And for Bordeaux fine wines, we go back even further in time, with Château Montrose 1947 for 30 francs, Gazin 1928 for 30 francs, Aubaï 1900 70 francs, and Gruau-Larose 1868 70 francs. Yes, you did hear correctly. In 1969, Nicolas proposed its clients to buy century-old wines in its year-end catalogue. But these bottles, listed as prestigious, were handled with special care. They could only be ordered in limited quantities and for a specific date. Each bottle would then be opened in Nicolas' cellars and the wine decanted before being delivered on the very same day. On the fine wine list, there are DRC wines, vintages of Clos de Tare, Lafite Rothschild or Petrus. In Bordeaux, the 1855 classification is pretty much in line with the price tags, and first growth such as Latour or Lafite are sold for double the price of second growth like Léoville-Lascaz or Montrose. Mouton Rothschild, which is not yet a first growth in 1969, it will be upgraded in 1973, is worth nearly as much as the first growth. The 1955 vintage sells for 40 francs when Aubryon is listed at 42 francs. In Burgundy, on the other hand, the situation is very different. Looking at this 1969 fine wine list, it appears that in every vintage available, Romanée-Conti is Burgundy's most expensive wine, justifiably so. However, upon deeper inspection, major differences appear in terms of pricing compared to what we are used to nowadays. Differences that have a lot to tell us about how much the region and the way it is perceived have changed over the last century. Let me explain. Burgundy red wines, 1959 vintage. Grands-et-Chezaux, 14 francs. Chambol-Musigny, 14 francs. Beaune, 18 francs. 1953 vintage. Musigny, 26 francs. Corton-Grancey, 28 francs. Corton, more expensive than Musigny. Beaune village wine, more expensive than Grands-et-Chezaux Grand Cru. This is very different from the standards of today's wine market. But in order to understand those prices, one has to consider the historical context of this era. After World War II, France has to rebuild its agricultural production, and productivity is what matters most. Burgundy is in a challenging economic situation, and wines are difficult to sell, even for today's most iconic domains who struggled to survive back then. In an interview to French radio in 2022, Aubert de Villaine stated that in those days, DRC could barely make ends meet and that the domain only became profitable in 1972. Unlike Bordeaux, where wines are easily identified thanks to their chateau name and each chateau often only has one or two wines, Burgundy and its myriad of appellations remains too intricate and complex for many clients to understand, so they rely on simple, famous names such as Beaune. In 1966, the Beaune Marconnet sells for 60 francs, 20 francs more expensive than the Richebourg. Even if the Marconnet plot, which is a Premier Cru, is one of Beaune's finest terroirs, the comparison with the Richebourg Grand Cru is surprising to say the least. You must keep in mind that the law of AOCs guaranteeing the origin of a given wine was only voted just before World War II against the will of most Burgundy negociants, who strongly campaigned against it, and many clients still don't understand its implications. And here, I want to pause to pay homage to Nicolas, who, back in 1931, 2 years before the first 6 AOCs were created as a result of Baron Leroy's lobbying, sent a letter to all his clients with the fine wine list. Here are some extracts of this letter that I wish to read to you. If we have been campaigning for 3 years in favor of the appellations of origin for Burgundy fine wines, this is not a crusade against Burgundy negociants. But why don't these negociants understand the irrevocable damage that would be done to finest crus of Burgundy if they were to disappear and be replaced by brands or commercial names such as Royal something? They should realize that the value of these Grand Cru plots lies not only in the quality of the wines they can produce, but also in the recognition of the appellation of origin they so deserve. We encourage owners of Burgundy Grand Crus to bottle their wines at the domain like they do in Bordeaux. And we encourage wine lovers to always request wines with an appellation of origin. Guaranteeing our wine's origin and authenticity is the only way to preserve the reputation of greatness earned over centuries. Today, we know what a difference that law on AOCs made for French vineyards, to the point that it has inspired wine regulations in many other countries. So, in order to write and sign such a manifesto in 1931, one had to be a real visionary, and Nicolas surely was one. It is this philosophy that would lead nearly a century later to the registration of Burgundy vineyards as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For 150 years, Nicolas has been the figurehead of French excellency in wine distribution, and the fine wine lists have been instrumental in building this reputation. They can still be found here and there nowadays in antique bookstores or on the internet. They tell the stories of the days gone by and the evolution of the French wine market throughout the 20th century. Nicolas was purchased from the family in 1984 and again in 1988 by the Castel Group that has given it a new direction, and it consists today of a network of franchise stores with over 500 shops in France and overseas. I hope you had a good time listening to this story, and if you enjoyed it, please take a second to like or rate it on your favorite podcast app. As for me, I'll be back next week with another wine story. Cheers!